Well, Bev, the American side, more than the Chinese side, has been foreshadowing what they'll discuss, and Taiwan is pretty high up there, as is the war in Ukraine. This is coming from the American side, what they want to discuss. It's usually China which raises concerns about American support for Taiwan. No surprise that this will be the most interesting topic, at least for those observing the meeting and whatever readouts we get, because Nancy Pelosi, the US House Speaker, is possibly going to come to Taiwan at some point in August on what would have otherwise been a significant but kind of regular, semi-regular visit of congressional members, but instead it's blown up into this diplomatic stoush where China has used its state media and its government spokespeople to signal that if she comes, the Chinese leadership, perhaps the Chinese military, will have to have some sort of forceful response. Now, this could mean many things, but the point is, you would think both President Biden and President Xi would have this potential visit and the more general issue of US support for Taiwan front and centre of their discussions.
Yeah, but do you think the possible visit by Pelosi could overshadow any meaningful talks?
Well, the Americans, Bev, are trying to frame this phone call as just part of regular communication between, let's face it, the world's two most powerful men. And this is the fifth time that they have held a phone call since Joe Biden became US president. So it's not as though Washington is trying to suggest that there is going to be any particular agreement or outcome out of this. The Americans are basically saying it's best for the world's two superpowers to maintain regular communication at the highest level. These two men haven't spoken since March, I believe it was. This is the first time they've spoken since the Ukraine war. And of course, one of the big American concerns is Chinese unofficial support for Russia. Now, Beijing has always said that it takes a neutral stance. It's not supporting Russia. It's not providing any aid or assistance. The way it sees things, it's the Americans who are providing assistance to the Ukrainians. But the US, of course, sees things rather differently. Beijing has tweaked its trading rules with Russia a little bit to basically allow the Russians to export a little bit more when it comes to things like commodities and oil. So the Chinese government has been trying to somewhat support Russia diplomatically and economically while it faces sanctions. So no doubt that's going to come up. From China's perspective, we had a government spokesman this afternoon, Bev, who didn't want to go into too many details, didn't want to preempt the Chinese president. So it will be really, really interesting, we believe, tomorrow morning Australia time when we get a readout of what these two leaders discussed.
Yeah. You know, there are concerns being raised about whether China would be prompted to take any sort of military response. How credible is that?
Depends who you speak to, Bev. The US military has said that they really don't think the Chinese side would do anything too unpredictable, and that the US military, as is customary, would provide assistance and support for any overseas congressional visit. So the Americans are sort of talking this down, but you obviously have deep divisions within the American power structure, because earlier in the week we saw some suggestions coming out of, I believe, the White House that there could be some sort of military response from Beijing. And then you have the Chinese state media, which it's a bit like a sort of government backbencher in Australia, sort of talking about policies. You're not going to get the executive decision makers necessarily filtering out their views in Chinese media outlets all the time, but you're not going to get people going against the central leadership. So we've seen some commentary in Chinese media suggesting that there could be increased Chinese drills, that you could even have Chinese fighter jets in the vicinity. There's even been talk, I think, from the American side of a possible intercept of Nancy Pelosi's plane, but most analysts talk down these possibilities. Here's where it gets tricky, Bev. Xi Jinping, he's facing a party congress later this year. He's under domestic pressure. maybe he feels under pressure to look strong and look tough and draw a line in the sand and try and do something to deter similar visits like this in future.
Yeah, and the Taiwanese, of course, are in the middle of it, but you'd expect that they quite like the US's support.
Well, you don't get a visit of US Congress members to Taiwan without the Taiwanese government facilitating it. And so President Tsai Ing-wen has been very low-key about this so far. We had the Taiwanese Foreign Ministry holding a regular press briefing today where they spent about 2 or 3 minutes basically saying we have no comment. Just to reiterate what we've said before, we have no comment. The interesting thing that their spokeswoman did say is that the Taiwan office in Washington has not received any definite plans regarding this visit. So make of that what you will, Bev, but the more this is discussed on both sides and here in Taiwan, the more pressure builds on everybody, on Nancy Pelosi not to cancel it, on Xi Jinping to look tough, and that's where things get a little bit worrying.
Yeah, indeed. We'll watch with interest. Good to talk, Bill. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Beth.